That I think the simplest answer is that would require a degree of unity, political unity, and decision making, where Europe has to, like the Baron von Munchausen, pull itself out of the morass, bootstrapping itself, and the challenge. It's not that we can't do it, but the political challenge is that any unified European approach, it doesn't matter which one you choose, has an asymmetrical cost. I mean, some states will have to pay more, and they would like to compensate. So, I mean, and we're quibbling in the European Union, about who is going to contribute this and who has to be compensated for that, and like, is the Netherlands supposed to pay for nuclear protection of the French force de frappe? No, that's a different column. So we organize that differently. We fragment this in such a way that the European unity remains stable, and that stops us from a unitary position to China.
大家好，这里是感人视觉频道。刚才这段精彩集锦，一位殘州嘉賓一殘這簡單。在這段精彩集錦，一位殘州嘉賓一裁得到府校，連荷蘭要不要拆法在的何威，还都能被拿出来反复掰扯。到底在州不是做不到斗一行动，而是美股改家都希望别人成才成北。这一周不是做不到斗一行动，而是美股改家都希望别人成拽。自己保留现在的自由，真惨的神败子的神败的起来像是共同行动，真惨的是各算各的神败子，真惨败的伊亚赛略伊燕还没面对外部挑战，真惨败就先陷入邓战赶贼。更耐人追味的是，他明明看到了这一周在港口、防疫和采用上的拮抗性，一也在熟难以形成一致力吧。中比在箍州港口的投资究竟只是商业布局，看似正在箍纸化更大的影响力，比雷埃夫斯港和汉堡港之感又比什么箍出现截然不同的结果。本期节目我命就箍州港口切入，看看中比如何角逐防疫、物流和处理大影将，也看看咪州面对见命大影将，也看看咪州面对见利基，究竟能不能把这半各自命听的棋真正下成一局
？No, and it can't. Yet.
Yes.
And France, of course, if I can cut a few corners, is the most state capitalist country in the European Union. So I'm not surprised. And also, France is playing this role, and I can understand it from its history and its economic structure, its political practice, everything, which is the beauty of Europe. We have 27 polished diamonds, each and all in their own logic, but very difficult to put in a nice composition in the crown of the European unity. And so France is the example of one example of a type of exposure to China risk, to US risk, and to European integration risk, which is very different from Germany, which is also very different from the frugal Nordics and the Dutch and the Belgians, that are more like clinging together because of their common interest in Europe in integrating. And France takes a different view. It has always done. And Germany is in a very different situation in its energy-based. So these are the fault lines within the European Union. And that is the main reason why we are not capable of returning the favor to China as they treat us. And China knows this. It's not their problem. It's our challenge. And that's also, maybe we have to apologize for that, Simon and I, because we have a vocabulary that systematically pushes the discussion away from territorial, corporate, geopolitical analysis and immediate interest, and towards a better and deeper understanding of systemic relations and how we should adapt and what possibilities for adaptation there are. And this is basically the difference between short-term and long-term approach, between zooming in on the urgent action that has to be organized right now and understanding where the hell we are, not just as France or as the Netherlands or China, but how we are embedded with all these relations in complex adaptive systems where China and Europe and the US paradoxically face the same challenge. So, I mean, this is just a different perspective, and I think it's one of the achievements of the China Knowledge Network that we try also to translate this into a political approach and a policy approach, which is tough stuff and the subject of another podcast.
No, but what struck me in your answer that you said that Europe is not ready to exert influence or even buy parts of Chinese ports yet. Could you elaborate more on that? What would Europe need, or what are the problems in that regard?
Well, I think the simplest answer is that would require a degree of unity, political unity, and decision-making, where Europe has to, like the Baron von Munchausen, pull itself out of the morass, bootstrapping itself, and the challenge. It's not that we can't do it, but the political challenge is that any unified European approach, it doesn't matter which one you choose, has an asymmetrical cost. I mean, some states will have to pay more, and they would like to compensate. So, I mean, and we're quibbling in the European Union, about who is going to contribute this and who has to be compensated for that, and like, is the Netherlands supposed to pay for nuclear protection of the French force de frappe? No, that's a different column. So we organize that differently. We fragment this in such a way that the European unity remains stable, and that stops us from a unitary position to China. Now, however, I should ask, even if the EU would be achieving this totally unitary position, which is a figment of my imagination now, China would not allow it, because China uses rules that it has developed, that it had good reasons to develop, and that worked. I mean, China did not opt to embrace the international legal order and then just receive investments from the US and Europe and live happily ever after. No, China is the only developing country that became an emerging market, that knew how to avoid the poverty trap, that escaped the shock therapy that the West has applied to some other countries. I'm not going into details now. So China had reasons. And I think where China now stands is, in a way, the proof that in a different approach, you can develop. And the way Europe is now organizing, because China is so successful, is the proof that what we have before espoused as, your developmental model to other countries, we now throw away, because we see for ourselves that it doesn't work that way. And I think that the best proof of that is the speech for the World Economic Forum of the Canadian Prime Minister.
Carney.
Mark Carney, saying, we live in the rupture, and it's and you cannot integrate into a system if that becomes the start of your own demise. I'm rephrasing him, I'm paraphrasing him. And I think that's where France can teach a couple of things to the European Union, but obviously Germany, for example, has a very different background and a very different interest, and has an industry that is greatly dependent on collaborating and integrating with Chinese industry, because just one example, Volkswagen is now just supplanting all its production lines for the EVs that they produce to China. So they don't want the European Union to high the tariffs.
And maybe as a follow-up and complementary perspective to what Mark just gave, if we roll with the analogy of the 24,000 container ship going to Europe and going back empty, why would any European company or nation want to have a stake in a Chinese port if there's no goods there to ship, right? So that, this is a black and white, very crude comparison, but there needs to be a logic. So that's one. Is there a commercial drive to do so? Second, and I don't have the data, and maybe you two have, I know that I think China holds an interest in about 35 ports in Europe, usually a minority stake in a terminal within a bigger port system. The only exception is Piraeus. We might touch upon that later.
Exactly.
I have no clue how ownership of Chinese ports looks like, and or terminals thereof, and if there's actually any European or American or other companies that have stakes in Chinese harbors. And maybe that's the other perspective I wanted to add, other than the market perspective, and that's the historical perspective, where if you look at Chinese history, the century of humiliation started with the unequal port treaties. I think that puts a very, and puts the, you point directly to a sore spot where historically Chinese were not very pleasantly surprised or with the whole situation, how that went down, right? So that might also form the historical reasons why, and again, I don't have the data at this moment, the option for a reciprocal investment in ports is maybe not as on the table as people would want it. So there's quite a few reasons, right? And it's not easy to, again, to give straightforward answers here, but it's good to keep these in mind.
Mark, you said earlier, unity is the way to go. Do you think, or don't you think that because the EU has a motto of united in diversity, that different member states' perceptions, for example, Germany adopting a more cooperative approach, the Netherlands maybe watching more over human rights, could actually be a catalyzer to engage on multiple levels with China? Instead of, for example, because now I'm thinking if we need a unified approach, we need to find a compromise. And compromise between 27 member states means always a watered down resolution because you need to compromise on the lowest common denominator. Would you also consider that, for example, that the EU can streamline its different approaches through different member states more effectively without taking a unified approach?
Yes, I think it's a bit paradoxical, but I think you hit the nail on the head. Because unified doesn't necessarily mean that you are centralist and one decision has to cover all problems. No, obviously, I think the strength of the European Union, and also I think this is a very deep-seated strength, how you deal with diversity and whether that is a force or a threat, is perceived very differently in China and in Europe. It doesn't mean that China is a totalitarian centralizing state and stops there, because it has actually quite a machinery dealing with complexity from which Europe can learn a lot. That's also another podcast. But it does mean that Europe has to adapt how actually this unison is going to be organized. It has to become more tolerant for the ambiguity between all these member states. But at the same time, it has to have a kernel, a core of action where they should be less ambiguous. And I think the Commission is trying to fight for this. There's a lot of politics. And politics is also always local around who gets to say what. It is behind closed doors. There's no public discussion on this.
一座港口表面上只是船舶靠岸、嘎先摆卸、寡物摆运的地方，但今天的邓论当买看到港口摆运的地方，但今天的邓论教我们看到港口摆位、交通、金融乃至维加安全。交通、金融乃至卫家安全，给一座港口被挠入更大的全球公安摆，一座港口被挠入更大的全球公安。它所承垂的就不只是嘎物，看包括起诉、资本、记局和影像力。也正因如此，中金企业在 FG 州港口的投资才批成为一股颠颠超出航文院本身的一代。这一期节目最值得我们记住的第一股检点是，影响力不一定来自直接控制。很多人以为只要中居没有完全爬下一座港口，就不必诈赌百姓，但建居往往更加复制。居一方掌握巨大的寡文量、洗澡能力和公刚居需求制，即使只持有少股，甚至没有持股，也可能透价寡物要在哪里卸下，有多伏击阿晕，哪些物流歇点，过得优先安排。逐步引降港口的婚贷方式，真正需要三查的不只是所有三比例，更是多掌握了资源，多掌握了三他的，多能先确定交易件，以及多有能力其他人离不开自己的浮木。第二股掰件是世宝三把正在港口这股空干里交背起去角度看，船舶越快完成弥卸，运运成本越低，效率越高，这本身完全符合商讲骑律。门带在于时必时加 C， 这本身完全符合商讲骑律。门带在于时之这把 Q 就不再只是起要之版的效率 ，Q 在对方可能接受更长期的回放数期，也可能把港口投资和线路、能源、细造量、金融服务链接起来，形成垂直整合的完整带系。大欧洲如果只用大一起叫、大一乔姆、大一教格来看待，就很容易忽略这些小呆化累计过所产生的绝靠性力量。比雷埃夫斯港和坎堡港的对照也提醒我们澳洲今天面对的困境。你不只是中民民比来的外部民民，更包括 F1 州自身的民比部分歧。西并层面在金融危机和资产私有化的资产塞力下，为外部资本打坏了大门。德居民搜更加重视投资比例、产乡利益和安全治展的平衡。这院举先举背过都有各自的秘密此原因对小屋里来扫。 长盟的共同起诉可以提供保固，对大型公量百家来怕，长百中保持长报合作又长让家来票，外来投资可能是长报合作又长败的成本不同，看到的利益不同，要求的辅项也不同，长盟就很难形成真正一致的对外政策。因此所评究新币确实既不一定是所有费家都非觉得哈的哈，也不一定是由一国记号替所有成因做出同一国确定。更健确的做法是成因差异，保留各系在地方和去降上的迷信，但在涉及民间及所切实区民安全、共安居性和共同施霸起诉的核心门带上，必须建立清楚的底线，尤其在港口门带上不能吸某些郡家服继承，需要追求成政府爱盟长期的爱略服，共同框架分价、养估辅效机制和透明切策，缺一不可。A 里还有一股更深藏的历史。周周不能只是不及抱怨中熏太教，也不能把所有门带都寻就因外部贼力。中极的崛起干预改击了全球参想和防疫格局，但大洲今天的依据也和自身的去公量化、政策分散、投资不足以及长期忽视产教能力有关系。大洲的起教失去市表分割，能源成本上升，细造量外移，并且原材料受到质押制，门带就已并不再是港口有多持有，而是九州看能不能保有自主先巧的能力。没有公教基础，就没有真正的安全；没有相对完整的公安，就很难单略自主；没有共同的政治意志，再较大的政策工具，也可能只是落在桌上的武器。同志，我们的也不能把降低分简化成全面暂罢散罢。泛舟不可能把自己封闭起来，也不可能全面暂罢散。美三洲以及其他地站的邦谊往来，真正重要的是在相互依赖以性存在的前提下，降低安的方面依立更多元的公安来源，保护安拜进集聚和撒散吧。你既合作建立在更公平、更透明、更互惠的起诉之上，穷加你不可怕，可怕的是穷交方根本不在同一套起诉里，俨然假交彼此完全平等的施霸环境中。港口之所以值得每一股普通人掐心，正是因为它追求拿回到我们的日常生活。对品能不能极致公安，汽车零件 C 部地短缺，能源 C 格是否三定，商店里的商品 C 部代气，这些看似 C 部颠的地塞政治，最后都可能透价港口和公安比到美国家庭。这些看似中足制，人们很难注意到背后的衣衫，但一旦公安中哪猜格失控，大家才 C 马猜比见。所批全球化没得来不是抽象概念，而是一套 feature 美国人生活紧密相连的系统。所以这期费用真正留下的门带，不只是中比在 B1 州港口要有多少投资，也不只是中比在采取多较应的措施，而是 C 州究竟想成为什么带的弱州，是 C 依靠各比各自盘算。在危机出现之后，被动辅救看似成因彼此以深度链缺，重新建立一套能减艰苦安全、发展效率公平的共同排略。这一苦先减不只靠愿盟，也靠太所有身全球化之代的瑜伽面对一股由多处力量共同塑造的世界。最有效的回昂不是恐慌，也不是逃避，而是看清自身的弱点，富足自己的能力，你在合作低度之间找到新的平衡。港口是寡无进出的入口，也是不同制度相遇的前捐。它提醒我们，任何依靠投资都可能捐动更大的产业，任何一股地方性的协定也可能在多年之后改移整股地的略格局。对中举而言，港口是全球布局的一部分；对周而言，港口素是一面杆子，照出它的烦忧分歧烦忧。接下来局势如何发展，取决于州能否把危机为首，能否把危机碎化为改革的动力，也取决于各方能否在相互尊重的基础上重新登论全球18昂在遵循什么法的起诉。欢迎大家在留言区分享你的看法，也别忘了点区。